All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another EPrime live stream. This is actually our first one of 2018, so welcome, everyone. My name is Devon Struthers. I am the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today's live stream is actually going to be about a really cool topic. So today's live stream is about a task called Cyberball, and I actually have a lot of kind of personal history with this task, and especially the researcher who developed it. So the researcher who developed Cyberball, his name is Kip Williams, and he developed this task as a means of inducing ostracism or social exclusion. Now the way that this does that is that this task, which is really cool, shows people throwing a ball back and forth. And you are, of course, a third player in their game of catch. And to induce ostracism, they actually, for a couple of trials and for actually quite a long time, don't throw you the ball. So you're just kind of standing there watching these other two people throw a ball back and forth. Now, when this task first started, it was live, and there were people actually throwing balls, and they had a script that they were going from, and people would throw a ball back and forth. But since it's the future, it's all on computers now. Now Cyberball, the software itself, developed by Kip Williams, is actually available online. They're currently on Cyberball version 5.0. But for those of you who would like to do this in EPrime, we're actually going to show you how to make that today. Now this task is a really legitimate task. When I was an undergraduate in psychology, or an undergraduate at my college in psychology, obviously, they actually told me that this task was so strong and so good at inducing the sense of ostracism that some people would actually end up crying in the middle of this task because they weren't getting the ball and nobody was actually interacting with them. So the way that we're going to make this in EPrime, instead of actually having two other people on versions of EPrime and using communication like we talked about last week to talk back and forth here, what we're actually going to be doing is we're going to be using a computer-generated confederate. So we're going to have two fake people set up, and we're going to have a preset bit of your preset conditions to throw this ball back and forth between the two other people. So let's go ahead and show you guys the videos first and all the resources that I have for this experiment, and then we'll go ahead and launch into making it. Now keep in mind, if you're following along with me at home, if I happen to go too fast, if you have any questions, anything like that, feel free to let me know in the chat window. I'm always happy to answer questions live. And if you are making this along at home and you'd like to see what a finished version of the product looks like, as soon as this live stream's over, I'm going to upload it onto our experiment library, so you can go ahead and take a look at it there anytime you want. So let's go ahead and take a look at the resources that I have for this first. So I have this nice little folder here called Cyberball. And I have a couple of movies here and a couple of images. So first, let's introduce you guys to the Confederates. So right now I have people that are just from the office. They're actually some of my coworkers, and I'm even on there. These are just who are going to be playing Cyberball, and these are going to come in the experiment by default. I'm actually going to design this experiment so that it's really easy to kind of swap these names out and these people out to whoever you would like. So, if you don't want to use the PST staff as part of your experiment, you can trade these people out for whoever you want. But the first one we have is Amy. And then we have Brian, who was in the UDP live stream, if you remember him. There's me. And then we have Lauren, Rich, and we have Scott. So these are going to be our Cyberball contestants for today. And then we have a couple of videos to show you guys. Now these are the videos of the ball being thrown back and forth. So we have 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 2 to 1, 2 to 3, 3 to 1, and 3 to 2. Now these sound a little technical and a little bit wordy and just like numbers. Oh, we actually had a question come in. Somebody asked if this video would be available after the live stream. It absolutely will. So this video is actually just going to be on our YouTube channel permanently after this. So, it's live right now, but anytime after, we should end at about 11:30. Anytime after 11:30, you'll be able to access this video whenever you want. And you can, skip around, skip the boring parts, those kinds of things. So, great question. All right, so these videos that I have, they seem a little bit like they're very randomly named, but the way that they're named is actually kind of clever, and we're going to use the name of these to kind of help build our task. So if we take a look here, let me go ahead and play this video for you, these little adorable cyber people, and this one is throwing the ball from participant 1 to participant 2. Now, every participant that does this task is going to assume the role of participant 2, and we're going to set up the startup info parameters to be like that. So this one, the 1 to 2, is just player 1 throwing the ball to player 2. And then if we do 1 to 3, this one is going to be player 1 throwing the ball to player 3, who is on the right. And of course, your player 2. And they all look very similar to that. We'll run through the task at the end, and you get to see all of them. One of my favorite parts about this task is the physics of the ball going whoop and back up. But regardless, these are the videos we have to work with. And I also have one special image here of your person holding the ball, because at one point we're actually going to be holding onto the ball and deciding who we're going to throw to, either player 1 here or player 3 right there. All right, so let's actually jump in to make this task now that we kind of have a sense of what our videos are and all the resources that we're going to be using here. Let's go ahead and open up EPrime. Now, I'm using EPrime 3. This is the latest version of EPrime 3, and I just closed out of the templates window and loaded a blank template here. For those of you who are following along at home, feel free to start from a blank template. We'll be making this completely from scratch today. Now, the cool thing about this is it actually is a little more complicated than I first thought. Now, when I first thought about this task, I was like, I'm just loading videos in EPrime, fine. But the important thing is we're going to need to track exactly who has the ball at all times. Because if we, for example, end up in a condition where we show the 1 to 3 video and player 1 throws the ball to player 3, we have to then show a player 3 video. We can't actually, because player 3 has the ball, we can't actually show a video that starts again with player 1 or starts with player 2, or the ball will have seemingly teleported. And then at that point, the effect is kind of lost on the participant, and they're kind of aware, okay, this is a computer game and isn't actually people actively, virtually throwing this ball. So there's going to be a little bit of inline script in there that kind of keeps track of that. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start with this experiment from the top down, so from the highest level to the very most minute detail. So the first thing that participants are going to see is they're going to see startup info parameters. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with those, you can get to those by double-clicking on the experiment object here at the top of the Experiment Explorer and clicking on Startup Info tab right here under the Experiment Object Properties. Now, the startup info parameters are those little text boxes basically that you see whenever you click run on an experiment. Now by default you are prompted to enter the subject ID and the session number, but we're going to add 3 more to this that are going to make this experiment a little more personal. And if you're following along at home and you'd like to load your own participants and things like that, feel free to make this as different as you want. I'm just going off of the PST staff. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to add another startup info parameter that allows the researcher to choose who participant 1 is, or who player 1 is, that player on the left. So I'm going to go ahead and click add to add a new startup info parameter, and I'm just going to call this one player 1. Now it's important that you remember what this log name is, because you can actually gain access to all of these all the information within the startup info parameter through an attribute reference, and you reference that attribute just by that name, that log name there of player 1. And we're actually going to be doing that a few times later. So my prompt is just going to be please select player 1. Now instead of numeric, I'm actually going to make this one a choice, and I'm going to give the researcher a choice of which participant to load for player 1. So the first one will be Amy. And I'm literally just going here through Amy, Brian, Devon, Lauren, Rich, and Scott. Brian, Devon, Lauren, Rich, and Scott. Now, what you're seeing me do here whenever I add a new participant here, add a new choice, is I'm just clicking on this Add New option button. This just makes a new choice for your list of choices, and all I'm doing is just clicking on that button, and I get a new entry after that. So that's all I have to do for player 1. I want to prompt the user, and I do want to enable it and log this data. So go ahead and click OK. Now if you notice it goes all the way to the bottom there, I'm actually just going to move this up to the top, and I'll put it just after my session. And I'm going to do this exact same thing for player 3. And I'm just going to make my log name there player 3, and I'll say please select player 3. Now this part here is really meant for the researcher. It's not particularly meant for the participant. we don't, it kind of breaks the immersion if participants are able to select their own opponents. So I'm going to go ahead and select choice here. Now the reason I bring that up is because this list is actually going to be identical to our first list in player 1. So theoretically, in probably the worst possible version of this task, each and every one of your opponents are going to be me, which is not ideal for anyone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have that same list, and if you're the researcher doing this, you're going to have to actively know, okay, I've selected, let's say, Brian as my first player, and I'm going to have to select then Devon as my third player, and I won't want to have 2 Brians or 2 Devons or something like that, because again, that kind of ruins it as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make my choices one more time. I'll just run through that list again, that Amy, Brian, Devon, Lauren, Rich, and Scott. So Amy, Brian, and whenever I'm done here, I just hit enter to kind of accept my choice. Devon, and I'll link a new choice. Rich, Scott, and Lauren. There we go. So now we have our possible choices for player 1 and our possible choices for player 3. Now the only other startup info parameter we have, after I click OK here, the only possible startup info parameter we have is we want participants to enter their name, or we want the researcher to enter the participant's name. This is going to kind of act as our player 2, and it'll kind of force the participant to think more about, you know, oh, this little hand on this screen, this is actually me, like this represents my hand. So I'm going to go ahead and move this guy up. So player 3 comes after player 1, and I'm going to add one more. And I'll just call this your name. Whoops. And I hit enter way too fast there. So my log name here is going to be your name, and my prompt is just going to be, please enter your name. Now my data type here, instead of numeric or choice, is actually going to be a string, because the string is just going to be, you know, whatever letters and number combination I decide to type on the keyboard. Default, I'm going to keep that at a question mark, just so participants know, okay, I have to delete the question mark and put something in here. And my max length, we'll call it 100 characters. If someone has a 101 character name, feel free to adjust, but we'll keep it at 100 for now. And then I'll go ahead and click OK. So now I have my 3 new prompts that I made, player 1, player 3, and your name. We're going to go ahead and move your name up, so it is just below player 3 right there. So now whenever we launch this experiment, we're going to see our subject, our session, player 1, player 3, and then a prompt for their name. I'll go ahead and hit apply and OK to save out of that. Now what I'm going to do is, the next thing we're going to do is actually start building some of the experiment. Now the first thing that we're going to do to build the experiment is usually a welcome screen, but I actually want to use those startup info parameters that I had just mentioned there, and I actually want to load them into an attribute that I can call or recall later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add an inline object. Now what we're going to be doing in this inline object is going to be doing something called a select case statement. A select case statement you can think of as a really big inline, or a really big if-then statement, or a fancier sort of if-then statement. It's an if-then statement if you have a lot of possible options. And what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to not only set the name of my player 1 and player 3 character, but it's also going to let us set the picture of our player 1 and player 3 character. And the attribute that we're going to make in here is actually going to be pulling double duty. And I kind of did that on purpose. So if you notice here, I have all of our names, just Amy, Brian, Devon, Lauren, Rich, and Scott, as JPEG files. I don't actually have them as like Lauren pick or Devon pick or, you know, Rich pick, something like that. I actually just have them as our name, and that's actually going to be really important for later. So like all the objects that we recommend here, we want to change this name of the inline object to actually reflect its function. So this one's just going to be called select players, because we'll be selecting the players that we'll be going against. So we'll go ahead and rename this to select players. And then go ahead and double click on this to open it. Now here's where we're going to build our select case statement. So select case statements have 3 important components. They have the part that you're actually selecting. So what am I like actually selecting out of my entire, experiment right now? So I'm going to say select case, and then the case that I'm selecting is going to be at first my player 1 attribute. And I know that it's an attribute because it's exactly what I called it in this startup info parameter. So I'm just going to be getting the values of what I entered for player 1. So you get the value of an attribute in inline script just by going c.getAttrib. And if you saw what popped up there, it's called script sense. It just makes it easier to type. So I'm getting the value now, and then this is something called a trib sense. Again, just makes it easier for you to build your experiment. I'm going to get the value of player 1 right here. So this is the first important component of my select case statement, is telling EPrime what case am I looking at. So what exactly am I looking at, trying to get the different values of. The other important part is obviously to tell EPrime when that select case statement is ended, and I'm going to show you that first. You just type end select. I'll type select correctly. So go ahead and do that end select. Now, everything that you want EPrime to find has to come between this select case statement and the end select case. So I'm actually going to make my row 2 here expand just a little bit more, because everything within here is the actual statement itself. And now I have to tell EPrime the different cases. So case Amy. So what this is like saying, hey, if the value of this player 1 attribute is Amy, do all this stuff. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually just going to do a simple c.setAttrib statement. So I'm going to make an attribute that I can then reference later. And if you follow along, we're going to actually reference it twice. So c.setAttrib. Again, I do that pretty fast. I'm pretty used to typing script in EPrime. My apologies, but all I did was just c dot. And then if you start typing setAttrib, EPrime recommends setAttrib right there. So I'm going to make the name of the attribute. And this name is actually just going to be called player 1 name, and then a comma, and then the name of your player 1, and I'm going to call this one Amy. There you go. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the rest of my my participants here. So I have Amy, I have Lauren. Now, if you're following along at home and you're wondering why I'm setting the value of an attribute to literally itself, the reason I'm doing this is just to get more scripting practice and to show off a select case statement. I'll show you an alternate way to do this where this type of script isn't as necessary a little later. But I'm going to do Amy, Lauren, and then all I'm going to do is actually just copy this here. Because what I can technically do is I can technically just set the value of whatever I'm referencing just to that attribute player 1, and it will be exactly the same. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't show off scripting. So that's why we're doing scripting. So I'll do one for Lauren. Let's do one for Scott. And all I'm doing at this point is just copying and pasting, so I don't have to type all of this out. We'll do one for Rich. We have one for Brian. And one more for Devon. This also makes the value that you get here, the value that you get from player 1, it also makes it a little more flexible. So if I need to start editing these values at all at any point in my experiment, all I have to do is reference this attribute and start playing around with it. Or if I reference, or if I call my picture something different, so if I call my picture like Amy Pick, I can type that in there. But since they're all just being referenced by name, that's how I'm going to reference them. So I told you I'm going to kind of show you two ways to do this. I'll reference my player 1 through this player 1 name attribute, and I'm going to reference my player 3 name through the alternate way later. So I'm actually not going to write any script for my player 3. Know that if you'd like to, you absolutely can. But what I'm going to be doing right now is showing you that secondary way to reference player 3 once we get to that point. Alright, so now that I have my select players inline object, the next thing I want to do is make a welcome screen for them. So I'm actually going to take a text display and put it just after select players, and I'm just going to rename this one to welcome. This will be welcoming participants to our task. I'm going to go ahead and double click on it to open it, and I'm just going to write a very simple message to participants. So just welcome. Welcome to Cyberball. No, I always spell that wrong. So here's kind of where we do a little bit of trickery. So I have, in this game, you'll be throwing a ball to other participants sitting at other computers. Throw the ball. So to throw the ball to the player on the left, press 1 on the keyboard. To throw the ball, keyboard, there we go. To throw the ball to the player on the right, press 2 on the keyboard. And then we say press space to let the other players know you are ready. All right, so just some very simple instructions. To throw the ball to the player on the left, press 1. Throw the ball to the player on the right, press 2. And then press space to let everyone else know you're ready. Again, this is where we're being a little tricky and a little not that honest. We need to give the participant the illusion that there's somebody else and that there's other people waiting for you and there's other people who are playing this game with you. So what we're going to do is we're actually click on the properties page icon on the top left-hand corner once we have our text there. Click on this duration input tab and we'll set the duration here from 1,000 to infinite. We'll change data log into time audit only just so we know how long participants were actually on this text display object. Go ahead and click add and add a keyboard, and I'll change my allowable to space. And then just go ahead and hit apply and OK. And that's really all I need for this slide or for this text display object. So once I've done this, I'm going to go ahead and save it quick because I'm going to have to start referencing some of those images and stuff later. So I'm going to click save as, and I just have a Cyberball folder here on my desktop that you saw with all the images and all the pictures loaded into it already. So I'm going to just call this one Cyberball. There we go. So now we have Cyberball. So let's go ahead and close out of this one. So now the next thing I want to add is I want to add a screen that kind of furthers that illusion that we're waiting for other people. So I'm actually going to take this text display and I'm going to put it just after welcome, and I'm going to call this one wait for participants. Now what I'm going to put on here is I'm just going to say that we're waiting for the other players to get ready. Waiting for other players to start. Now what this is going to do is, again, it's going to kind of further that illusion that, hey, there's other people and maybe they might not be done reading the instructions yet. So this is going to kind of solidify that in the participant's mind. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page icon in the top left-hand corner. Click on this duration input tab again. And this time, instead of setting this to infinite, because it wouldn't make sense to make them wait forever, let's just set it to something random like 1,500. Though it's enough time for the participant to say, okay, we're waiting for other players, and then the game is going to actually start, launch itself. So I'm going to change my data logging right now to time audit only, and I'm not going to enable an input mask. I don't want participants to click through this, or that's going to let them know, this is just part of the task. It's already built in. So go ahead and click apply and OK. And I'm going to close out of this. So now's when we actually get into the meat of programming the task, and especially keeping track of who has that ball, because that's going to be another really, really important thing that we keep track of. So we need to actually start the ball in somebody's hand. And we're actually going to start the ball in player one's hand, which is going to be that little, call them dough people, the little dough person in the top left-hand corner of the screen. That's going to be our player one. So what we want to do is we want to first make a variable that's going to keep track of who has the ball. And this variable is going to be called current player. Now, this current player variable is going to be used throughout the entirety of the experiment because we want consistency in who has the ball. Now, the only way to get EPrime to have a variable that's concurrent throughout the entire experiment is to do something that we call defining it globally, or making a global variable. Now, the way to make a global variable is to make it in the user script. Now, that's actually why, if you're new to EPrime 3, or if you used EPrime 2 and are moving over to EPrime 3, that's actually why our user script is at the very top of our experiment here, just under the experiment object. It's to show you that any variables that are loaded into EPrime in this user script are accessed throughout the entirety of the experiment, instead of just, wherever it's defined. So if I go ahead and double click on my user script, you can see that it looks exactly like an inline window. It's a little special though. You can only actually use this to define subroutines. We actually have, if you look at the top of the, if you look at the top of the screen here, we actually have, this is our subroutine explorer. It'll cycle through any subroutines you define on here. But you can only really define subroutines and variables in the user script. You can't actually make an if-then statement, or like we did earlier, a select case statement. So that's really important to know about this user script. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a variable, and I just do that using a simple dim statement. And I just want to call this one current player. And I'm going to just call current player as long. Now, I could, of course, use an integer. It's only going to be cycling through 1, 2, or 3. But, I mean, there's really no difference because, you know, we have modern computers with plenty of memory on them. It doesn't really matter between integer or long in this point. All right, so now that I have my user script and I have that current player variable set, I need to make another inline object just after my wait for participants that starts the ball in player 1's hand. So I'm going to go ahead and take an inline object and put it just after my wait for participant. And I'm just going to go ahead and call this one initialize player 1. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this to open it. Now the script here is going to look incredibly simple at first, and it's going to get a little more complex later, but right now it's going to look like it's almost deceptively easy to give the ball to player 1. So all I'm going to do is just set the value of that current player. So the value of that current player attribute, or variable, sorry, that I had just made in my user script, I'm going to set this one equal to 1. Now we will of course be manipulating this on a per trial basis, so this keeps track of who has the ball right now. But it's actually just going to be used for this right now. Right now it'll just be set to 1 because of course we want to give the ball to player 1. Alright, so we go ahead and close out of that, and now I'm actually going to make my block list. Now the block list is what's actually going to cycle between two of our conditions. Now this is actually using the block list the way that in every other live stream I go, well, the block list looks a little boring right now, but it gets better and more complex experiments. This is a complex enough experiment that this block list is going to be pretty useful. Now what we're going to be doing is it's going to be basically a practice version of the task at first, where the participant is included. And I'm actually just going to call this one inclusion proc, just because I'm not creative. Now inclusion proc is going to be almost an equal chance, actually in favor of the participant receiving the ball in a throw. So, you know, somebody throwing the ball to the participant and then throwing back. And this is only going to last for 5 trials. Now it's only going to last for 5 trials because that's when the exclusion starts. But we want participants to get a sense that, okay, this is how the game works. They're going to be throwing to them. I'll be getting the ball sometimes. And it'll be really nice to go back and forth like that just for 5 trials. So to set that up, what I need to do is go ahead and take a list object and put it just after my initialize player 1. And I'm going to rename this list object to block list. We'll go ahead and hit enter there to save that. And I'm just going to save my experiment quickly. Now, let's go ahead and double click on block list to open it. Now, block list is actually going to look a little more boring. I mean, you know, it generally does, but it's just going to be a very simple list object. So what we're going to do is we're just going to fill in the procedure. Now, I had mentioned that the inclusion is going to be first. Participants are first going to be allowed to receive the ball, not allowed, but they're going to receive the ball a little more. They're going to be throwing back and forth with players. It's going to be more like a game. And honestly, I love playing this part. It's kind of fun. So I'm just going to call this one inclusion block proc, and I'm going to hit enter there. Now it says the procedure does not exist. Would you like to create it? And you can see that it doesn't exist over there. I click yes, and it becomes a procedure. Now it says, would you like it to be the default value for newly created levels? I'm going to say no, because I'm going to have only one more level, and it's not going to be inclusion block proc. Inclusion block proc. That is a tongue twister. All right, so there's my inclusion block proc. I'm going to go ahead and add one more, and this one is, of course, going to be exclusion block proc. Now here's where our experiment designs might differ a little bit. If you would like the inclusion and exclusion conditions to be intermixed, what I recommend doing is setting the selection method here to random. However, the way that I'm setting up the task, and the way that I kind of like to do this, is I want the inclusion block proc to be first, so participants have, as I mentioned before, they have that sense of being a part of it, and then they're excluded from it. So I'm going to keep this to sequential, so all my inclusion procedures happen first, then my exclusion procedures happen. Now, I had mentioned that I want to run 5 different blocks of inclusion. I want the ball to be thrown back and forth 5 times, and I want them to be included for those 5 times. So to make sure that this runs 5 times, what I could do is I can just spam this button here, the add level button, over and over and over. And what that'll do is it'll make different levels, and I can set them all there. Or, to be more simplistic, I'll just set the wait here to 5. And since this is sequential selection, what EPrime is going to do, it's going to run through all 5 of these inclusion procedures before it gets to the exclusion. And I'm going to go ahead and set the weight for this one to 100. That way, it's going to have 100 exclusion procedures after my inclusion ones. So if you see here, I have 105 samples total. Sequential selection, that's all we need. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of these, and let's focus on inclusion block proc first. So like every time I have these very similar block procs, these are going to end up looking very similar, and I'm going to be doing a lot of copying and pasting in the end just to kind of, ensure that everything is quick and easy. So it's not actually going to take as long as it seems to make the rest of this task. But now we kind of get into the kind of like complicated part of it, the real like meat and potatoes part. So now that we have my block list here, I'm going to make another list that's going to represent the inclusion part of the task. So for that reason, I'm going to rename this one to inclusion list. Let me make sure I spelled that right. There we go. Inclusion list. Go ahead and double click on this to open it. Now, inclusion list is actually going to look a little boring. So usually I have a list object where I'm like, oh, this one's going to look boring. That's actually this one. So the first thing I want to fill out in my inclusion list is the procedure. I'm just going to call this one inclusion proc. Going to go ahead and click enter there. And sure, I'll make the default value for newly created levels. That's all right. So my inclusion proc in my inclusion list, and then I need one more. I'm going to go ahead and click an add attribute here, and I'm going to call this one movie name. Now, I'm calling this one movie name, and I'm actually setting it at this point. So I actually have a default movie to load into my movie display objects before I go ahead and change what they are. Now my movie display name, I mentioned that I want participant 1 to throw first. I'm actually just going to call this one 1 to 2. And these are just WMV files, if I spell that right. There we go. WMV. There we go. That order. So the reason that I know that my video files are WMV is if I look in this task here, it actually says WMV next to them. Now I know Windows 10 and beyond likes to do this. I think it thinks it's cool, honestly. It likes to show these icons here, so you can kind of get a preview of what it is. But I don't actually like this view because you can't tell what kinds of files these are, and it's super important to EPrime to know what kinds of files these are. So I'm actually just going to change the view, and I actually like to look at them in the details view. So you can see the date modified, is this the most recent one, and the file type and even the file size. So this is actually how I'm going to set this up. So I just know that I'm loading my 1 to 2 video. There's my 1 to 2, and it's .wmv there. And this one's actually just going to be just a 1 cycle. It's just going to be exactly like this. It's not going to actually do much. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close out of this, and then I'm going to open up my inclusion proc here. Now, inclusion proc is obviously the inclusion task. I have a video preloaded into it that I'm going to be referencing later, and that'll be quote-unquote my first video. But I'm going to go ahead and take this inline object, and I'm going to put it at the very beginning. Now, what I'm doing in this inline object is this inline object's actually going to decide, does player 1 have the ball? Does player 2 have the ball? Or does player 3 have the ball? And then it's going to jump to different points in the experiment based on who currently has the ball. So this is actually just going to be called goToPlayer. Whoops. I'll go ahead and rename this to goToPlayer, because this is going to actively look at the value of that current player variable that we had set, and then it's going to jump to a different point in the experiment based on who has the ball. So my goToPlayer inline is going to be very simple. It's going to be an if-then statement. So I'd mentioned earlier that select case statement I made in select players is just going to be a modified version of my of an if-then statement. So this is what an if-then statement looks like for those of you who aren't familiar. So I will say if current player equals 1, then, and we know that current player is currently set to 1 at the very beginning because of our initialized player 1 inline, then I'll do a goTo statement and then do player 1. And right now, these aren't going to make too much sense, but I'll show you how we use these goTo statements in a second. And I'll do else if current player equals 2. Then go to, you can probably guess what this is, player 2. And then finally, else if, there we go, current player equals 3, then go to player 3. And then I'll just type an end if statement there. Now what we're doing here with these else if statements, and keep in mind that there are two ways to do an else if statement. There's a way to do an else if that's connected like that, and there's a way to just kind of have them as separate words. If you have them as separate words, it's literally like telling EPrime else and then starting a new if then statement. But if you have them connected like this, it's a continuation of that larger if then statement, which is why we have those connected and why we don't have to actually add another end if statement. So I have just looking at 3 conditions. I'm looking at what that current player is, and I'm taking a look at if it's 1, then I'm going to something called player 1. If it's 2, I'm going to something called player 2. And if it's 3, I'm going to something called player 3. So it's actually pretty easy the way that we're setting this up. Now I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. Now, those go-to statements, what they do in EPrime, for those of you who don't know, is they actually take the experiment and do what we call a jump. We jump to a very specific point in the experiment. Now, the points in the experiment are defined entirely by us. Now, if you were paying attention when I was doing that inline, you notice that it was called player 1, player 2, or player 3. Now, player 1 is going to be defined by a label object. So I'm going to go ahead and take a label object, and if you followed along and watched any of my videos about what all the E objects are, this label object is literally just like saying, hey, I'm a point in the experiment, you can jump to me if you want, and you can call it whatever you want. Now by default it's called label 1, but we're going to rename this one to player 1. So EPrime knows that whenever player 1 has the ball, it needs to jump to this player 1 flag. So that's all that go-to statement is it just saying, okay, if it's player 1, we're going straight to this flag. And we're going to be doing that jumping around. We're going to be doing that kind of a lot. So what we're going to do after this player 1 flag is we're actually going to make one last list object. Now, we have our block list, which determines, whether we're in an inclusion or exclusion procedure. We have this inclusion list, which is going to allow all of our inclusion procedures to be on the same procedure here. And then we have one more list object that's going to determine what video is going to be played and whether or not that video is going to be an exclusion video or an exclusion video. So let's go ahead and make that list now. So we'll take a list object from our E objects here and go ahead and drop it just after player 1. And I'm going to save just to be sure because I had done a lot of work. I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to list player 1. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Now let's go ahead and double click on this to open it and see its properties. Now this one's going to be just a little bit more involved. So what I'm going to do here first is I'm actually going to have another procedure, and this is just going to be the procedure for whenever player 1 has the ball. This is what's going to be showing the videos, and we're going to be doing some inline object to manipulate who the player 1 will throw to, and also who is going to be receiving the ball. So the procedure here is just going to be called play 1 proc. And it says doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. Would I like to make it the default value of newly created levels? Again, I'm going to click yes. So in my list player 1, I'm going to have that procedure. Now I'm going to go ahead and add one more attribute here, and we have our current player variable, which is going to track who has the ball. We're going to make one more attribute here, and that's going to track who the ball is being thrown to, and we'll call this one target player. Now the target player, in the case of our player 1, can only be one of 2 targets. Player 1 can't throw the ball to himself, obviously. That'd be really rude if he did. So the target is either 2, I'm going to add one more row here, or 3. So player 1 can only throw the ball to player 2 or to player 3. Now here's how we induce inclusion and exclusion, is we actually change the weight of these objects here. Now we change the weight of these objects to either be a weight of 1. So right now there's an even chance that player 1 is going to throw the ball either to the target player, player 2, or player 3. If we change the weight here to just to be, let's say 10, they now have a 10 to 1 odds that the ball is going to be thrown to the player, which is very inclusive. Now the one thing that I do want to notice here, or I do want to bring your attention to now that we have this all set up, is up here, the summary part. It says we have 11 samples, 1 cycle equals 11 samples, and we're going through in sequential selection. If we run it like this, what we're going to see is at the very beginning, player 1 is going to throw the ball to player 2, so to me. Player 1's going to do that. Then the ball is going to appear back in player 1's hand, and he's going to keep throwing me the ball 11 times, or well, 10 times, and then throw to player 3 on the 11th time. We don't really want that. we only want one of these possible videos to run, even though we have 11 of these possibilities. So right now it's set to run 11 times, but I want them to be more odds. I wanted a 10 to 1 odd. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go to the properties page here. Just click on the selection tab, and I'm going to first change the order to random. And I'm going to change the order to random because I want them to actually be odds. I don't want, the first 10 times player 1 has the ball to be thrown to me. Otherwise, that's not really going to work out well. Let's go to the Reset Exit tab then, and I actually want to exit the list after one sample. Now, I want to exit the list after one sample just because, I want participant 1 to throw the ball to me, and then obviously it needs to go into player 2 proc after that. So I want to keep this exactly the way it is now with my exit list after one sample, and my reset sampling, I'll keep that at after all samples or 11. I can, if I want 10 to 1 odds every single time, and if I keep that at all samples, it'll be 10 to 1 odds, then 9 to 1 odds, then 8 to 1 odds every single time the list runs. If I want to keep those odds the exact same, what I want to do is I want to change this reset sampling and define cycle after one sample. So now, every time EPrime gets in this list, it has 10 possibilities to choose player 2 and 1 possibility to choose player 3. So I'm actually going to keep it like that. So now that I have my list set up, let's actually jump into making the procedure itself and everything that entails. Because we have all these variables set up, let's actually start using them, all these variables and attributes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just have an inline object here, and it's going to be called prepare player 1. Now, the reason I'm making this prepare player 1, there we go. The reason I'm making this prepare player 1 inline object is because I want to get the value of the current player. I want to make sure that it's player 1, and then I want to make sure that player 1 is throwing the ball to a person that actually makes sense. So the target player. We could get into instances with our target player variable and our current player variable, where I'm going to run into times when target is going to be 1 and current is going to be 1, and I'll run into times when the video that we want to play is going to be 1 to 1, and that video doesn't exist, and we'll get an error. So this inline object is just protecting against those things. So I'm going to say if current player equals 1, then I'm going to set the value of an attribute. So c.setAttrib, and this is just going to be that movie name attribute that I had made in my block list there. Now, it's currently set to 1 to 3, but I don't want that to run every time. I actually want this to change on a per trial basis. So here's where that current player and that target player. So I'm going to just say that this is going to be 1, 2. Now I'm calling it 1, 2 because you notice all my movies that start with current player are going to be 1, 2. Or start with player 1 are going to be 1, 2. Now I'm going to do ampersand because I'm going to be doing something called concatenating. I'm then going to tack something else onto the end of this. And I'm just going to get the value of that. Go c.getAttrib. And I'm going to get the value of that target player attribute that I had just referenced in that list. So now I know that I'm going to be throwing the ball to either player 2 or player 3 based on whatever was in that player 1 list. I'm going to concatenate one more time. I'm just going to add .wmv to the end of that. So now what this is actually going to print out is the value of a movie name attribute that's going to be referenced in a video. It's going to make an attribute reference to 1, 2, and it's going to be 2 or 3. So 1 to 2, 1 to 3, .wmv here. Go ahead and save that. All right, so now that I've done that part, I just need an else statement. So if the current player doesn't equal anything else, I'm just going to say c.setAttrib again. And I'm going to set the value of that movie name attribute one more time. And keep in mind, I like script sense a lot because instead of having to actively type all these things out, it pre-formats everything. So it gives me a higher or a lower possibility of any syntax errors. 1, 2, ampersand, current player. And then I'll add that .wmv at the end of that. And all this is doing is just making sure that if current player is 1, we are in the right procedure. Otherwise, we're going to have it throw to 1. And if. And there we go. So that's really all we need for that prepare player 1 inline object there. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of all of this. And I'm going to go ahead and open up my Play 1 proc again. Now the next thing we need is, now that we have the video that we're going to play, we need to actually play it. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a slide object and put it just after my prepare player 1. And I'm going to go ahead and save this quick. Now I'm going to rename this one here just to, we'll call this one player slide. Because this is really where our players are going to be. All right, so now that we have our player slide, what we're going to do is we're going to actually set up the way that this task looks. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have a video object. So this is going to be the movie that plays for participants, those movies that I had referenced earlier. And I'm going to just get rid of that. I clicked image by accident. Go ahead and have a movie object, and we're going to put it nice and big in the middle here. So this is kind of the focal point of this slide object. There we go. And actually, I'm going to make sure it's center by clicking on the properties page here. And I'll make the position here center and center. I was actually off by 3% of the screen. I always like to play that little game with myself. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to do is load that movie name attribute that I had made in my, I added in inclusion list here. And then I also set it in this inline script here. So what I want to do here is I want to click on the properties page, and under file name, I want to make an attribute reference to movie name. And all it's saying is that this movie name that I have here, this file name, is going to be variable. It obviously has two choices. It's either going to throw to 1, or sorry, 1 is either going to throw to 2, or it's going to throw to 3. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply to save that. I'm going to change one more property here, and it's called this stretch property. I'm going to set this one to yes. Now what that does is it makes sure that the entirety of the video can fit within that area that I defined here for the movie. So it's not going to try to go on, on outside. It's not going to look too small. It's actually just going to take up the exact space that I defined for the video here. So now that I have my video playing, the next thing I want to do is I want to actually set who the players are and where they are. So if you remember, player 1 is on the left here, and I'm going to go ahead and take this slide text sub object, and I'm going to put it right over here. Now, obviously, it's going to be way too big, so let's trim it down just a little bit. I'm going to put it over here. And actually, I'm just going to shrink this a little more, just so everything all kind of fits on the screen. There we go. So player 1 will be right about here, and what I'm going to do is for player 1, if you remember, I have my inline script that I set up here. I am setting this to the value of player 1 name. So my player 1 name is how I reference the name of the player 1. So I'm going to go ahead and change the text in this text display object from text to player. Whoops. Sorry, so what you saw there was a very aggressive use of script sense. If you click on a left square bracket in a slide text sub object like this, it's going to come up with a list of all the attributes that I set in my experiment. So I want that player 1 name, and it says right here, it says player 1 name as defined in script editor. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. So now instead of player 1 name, it's going to fill in with the name of one of my players. And then I want to copy this object because I want it to be the exact same size. So I'm going to hit Control C and then Control V. And what that does is it's actually going to make a new instance of that literally over top of it. So now if I move it and just bring it right across the screen there, you see that player 1 name stays there, and that new copy I made was there. Now, I had mentioned earlier that I was going to reference these in two different ways. I wanted to demonstrate that select case statement, so I made this player 1 name. But I also want to reference my player 3. So to do that, I'm going to do that attrib sense, and what you see here is you actually see player 3. Now this is going to fill itself in with the name in the exact same way that this had right here. So I didn't necessarily need to do that player 1 name conversion. Again, it was just to kind of demonstrate that select case statement, but you can also get that same information just by referencing player 3 there. Now what I'm going to do just for my own sanity is I'm going to make sure these are on the same line along the y-axis. So I'm going to check the properties page of player name 1, check out frame here, and the y position is 52. And I'm going to check the same thing here, and it's 52. Perfect. So now I have my player 1 name and player 3 name. Now all I need to do is load their picture. So I'm going to go ahead and take this slide image sub-object and add it to my slide there. I want to resize it so it fits nice and neat right above there. Oh, sorry, looks like my video cut out temporarily. Looks like we're all back now. All right, so I'm going to put my little player image above there, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page icon. Now, what I'm going to do, since I said that attribute's going to be pulling double duty, this is another thing that I wanted to demonstrate, is I want to demonstrate how to use an attribute in 2 different ways. So right now, it's filling in player1 name and just filling in that text. But if I do player1 name here and put .jpeg at the end, what it's going to do is it's going to tack on or concatenate, like I had mentioned earlier, that player1 name property. It's going to add .jpeg to the end of it, and I want this to stretch. And now I'm going to be referencing those images. There we go. Looks like my screen went a little blank again. Sorry about that. All right, and all I did was just do a quick copy and paste of that, and I'm going to drag it over here. And all I want to do is change the name of this one, or the file name. And instead of player1 name, all I want to do is reference this in the exact same way, and just do player3. And there we go. So now this slide should be set up pretty well, where what participants are going to see is they'll see the little animation of the people throwing the ball back and forth, and they'll see player 1 with their name and picture, and player 3 with their associated name and picture. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now the only thing I want to do is if you go ahead and take a look at the general properties here, I'm going to do something that's kind of cool that I like. I'm going to set the data logging here to standard, but I'm going to set the duration to infinite and not set an input mask. Now the reason I'm not setting an input mask is because I don't want participants to have any say over what happens on this slide. I don't want them to click anything. But under most circumstances, what would happen is if I set this to infinite, what's going to happen is this will just stay on literally indefinitely, and participants won't have an option to move on from it. However, if I go into my slide movie sub-object and I set this end movie action property from none to terminate, what's going to happen is this slide object is going to move on once the entirety of my movie is done playing. And that's really when I want this to end. So this allows me to not actually have to figure out how long my movie is and then figure out the duration on a per trial basis depending on how long the movie is. I can actually just set this end movie action to terminate, and the slide will go away whenever the movie's done playing. All right, so now that I have my player 1 slide here, I need one more inline object. And that inline object is, I'm actually just going to call this one send next player. Oops, there we go. Send next player. Every time I say oops when I do stuff like that, honestly, all I'm doing is I'm used to hitting F2 to rename, and F2 on this laptop I'm using dims the screen a little bit. All right, so now that I have my send next player inline object, all I want to do is I want to just say current player equals, and then just the value of that attribute that I have. So c.getAttrib and that target player. Now what this is doing is it's saying now the current player, instead of being, whoever it was now, so instead of being 1, is going to be whoever just received the ball. This is kind of how we track who has the ball right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, if you remember my current player attribute was a long data type, I want to just do clng. And what that does is in EPrime it casts the value of this as a long. So instead of this being the value, or instead of this target player just being an attribute, I'm actually now turning it into a long, so it's compatible with this current player. Go ahead and close out of all of these once that's done. And now I just need one more little thing here. So now that I have this, now that this is like all set up, I need to go into my inclusion proc here, and I need to add one more inline object just after this list player 1. And this one is just, I'm going to rename this one just to, I'll say go to end. Now what this is going to do is it's actually going to send participants, it's also going to send participants to the very end of the procedure once they're done with player 1, because I don't want it to then go to player 2 and player 3. I want it to actually go to this part. So I'm just going to say go to, simple go to statement, and then it's just going to say go to, I'll call it the end. This is something that I'll make earlier. We actually have a really good question that came in. So someone said, I must have missed something, got kicked off of Wi-Fi. I'm really sorry to hear that. They said, but I keep getting an error that says unable to update frame marker, and it seems to be a difficulty loading some of the videos. So that is something that definitely happens whenever you load videos. This happens pretty rarely, but generally what it is it has to do with the codecs in your installation of EPrime. We actually have a pretty great tutorial online about something called codec config, and all that it means is that your computer's just having trouble loading the movie and getting that frame rate of that movie to play it with the best millisecond accuracy. If you want to play these videos while you're following along, I do recommend doing codec config quick. You can get to it through tools, and then by clicking on codec config, which is just right here, and then pointing EPrime at one of those videos and loading the codecs that way. Otherwise, definitely make a support ticket, and I can kind of troubleshoot whatever it might be going on with your computer. Just go to support.pstnet.com and let me know. But that is a really great question. Thank you for asking. All right, so now that we have our list player 1 set up, let's go ahead and make player 3 first. So I'm going to make player 3 first and then player 2, because player 3 is going to look identical to player 1. It's the non-subject player, or the non-participant player, so it's going to look extremely similar. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a list object and put it after go to end, and I'm going to rename this one to list player 3. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this, and it's just going to look exactly like our list player 1. So this is going to be, procedure is going to be called play 1 proc. Or, sorry, it's going to be play 3 proc. Sorry about that. Play 3 proc doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. I'm going to add one more level here, and I'm just going to call this next one this target player. So if I go ahead and click on add attribute, I'll call it target player. And target player in this case is either going to be 1 or 2, because 3 can't throw to 3, obviously. So I'm going to set the weight here to 10 for my second player, because this is our inclusion proc, and I'm going to keep it 10 to 1 odds, and then I'm going to do the same changes to the properties here. I'm going to go to selection, change that one to random, set my reset exit, and I'm going to reset sampling after 1 sample, and I'm going to exit the list after 1 sample there as well. So since this is stuff we've done before, I'm going to move through this a little faster, just to save time, and because honestly I can talk all day, and nobody wants to hear that. So we'll go ahead and jump back into our play 3 proc here, and these are going to look extremely similar. So I'm going to have an inline object here. This one is going to be called prepare player 3. Prepare player 3. Oops, that's 2. There we go. And the contents of this inline, and what I'm going to do is copy and paste them from prepare player 1, so I don't have to type all of it, is it's going to be exactly the same, only if current player equals 3. Then I'm going to go into this inline object, and of course my movie names are going to start with 3. So if that movie name equals 3 to, 3 to 1 or 3 to 2, and that's what that movie name is going to be. Now, as far as this player slide is concerned, I actually don't have to make that again, because all of it is kind of fluctuating between the target player and the current player. So I don't have to change anything that's actually in there. So what I'm going to do is just take this player slide and drag it and drop it there, because it's just going to be the same player slide. And then I actually don't even need to change that send next player inline either, because this is so generic. It just says current player equals target player. So all I need to do is just take this send next player and drag it to the end of there, and we have the entirety of our play 3 proc done. The only other thing I need to do is I need to go ahead and go back into my inclusion proc, and I need to have a go to end inline as well. And to do that, since you can't move this, if I move this over, it's not going to copy and paste it the way I want it to. What I'm going to do is go to my browser window here and find that go to end label. That's up here. Go to end there, and I'm just going to put it there. So now I can have 2 instances of the same thing on the same procedure that way. I'm going to save it just because I've done a lot of work here. And after player 3, obviously, is going to be the end of the procedure. So what we're going to do is take this label object, drag it and drop it to the very end there. And I just called this, I called it the end. So in my label object here, what I'm going to just call it is I'm going to call it the end. And of course, the end has to be the last thing in the procedure. Now, I did this in kind of a weird order just because I could reuse some of the things that I had done earlier. But what I want to do now, and hold on, let me close out all these windows because I don't need all the windows open. So I had done player 1, I've done player 3. I'm actually going to put player 2 right in the middle just because I like seeing 1, 2, and 3 like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add another list object here. And I'm going to put this just between 1 and 3. Technically, it can come afterwards if you really want it. I just like the 1, 2, and 3 to come in order like that. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one to list player 2. Now, list player 2 is obviously going to be for the procedure where our player 2 has the ball and will be throwing the ball. So this one might look a little different, and it's actually going to look a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this, and the procedure here is going to be called play to proc. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. There we go. And we're not actually going to have any more levels. It's just going to be this. So that's all we need to do to that play to proc, and let's go ahead and double click on this. Now this is going to look a little bit different than the other two procedures, which is why I wanted to do those first, because this one's a little more involved. Because play to proc means that the participant has the ball. So what we want to do for play to proc is we want to first give a slide object, and I'm going to call this one throw choice. Now it's going to look very similar to our play slide. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to make a copy of play slide. So all of my little E objects are already set up exactly the way I want them, but I'm going to change one very crucial part of it. So what I'm going to do to copy this is I'm going to highlight player slide here, hit Control C, and then hit Control V on my play to proc. And I'm just going to call this one throw choice. Whoops. And I'm going to rename that correctly to throw choice. There we go. And I'm going to double click on this to open it. Now, if you look here, I have my player name, my player 1 name, my player 3 name. I'm going to change this part of it. Now, this part of it here is what shows that video of everything going back and forth. This one is instead going to be an image. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I'm going to take an image and put this here. And I'm going to go ahead and expand it so it was roughly that same size. And I'm going to load a very particular image into here. So I'm actually going to click on the properties page, and I'm going to set a file name. Now my file name is going to be this 2ball.jpg that I had shown you earlier. And I'm going to change my stretch mode to yes, click apply and OK. So now, every time participants get to this slide, it is when they're currently holding the ball and they have the choice to throw to either player 1 or player 3. So the response to this slide determines what video we're going to be showing. So I want to change the properties of this object as well. I'll click on this duration input tab. I want to make the duration infinite, but I want to add a keyboard input mask. So this isn't going to play until the entire duration of a video. This is going to be on the screen until participants choose who to throw to. And I'm going to throw to either 1 or 3. And of course, there's no correct answer. It really doesn't matter. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK. All right, so now that I have my throw choice, all I need to do now is I need to make an inline object that's going to determine who the next player is. So I'm going to go ahead and add an inline object there. And this one is just going to say next player. Or I'll just call it get next player. There we go. So the get next player inline object is what like I said, is going to determine what video is actually going to be playing. So what I need to do is get next player. I need to set current player equal to throw choice dot resp. So what this is doing is I'm getting at the response property of that throw choice object. So when they clicked either 1 or 3 in this throw choice object, they're going to be that's how they determine who they're going to throw it to. Now there's one little quirk in EPrime that I want to bring up about the .resp property. The .resp property always saves as a string in EPrime. Now this trips up a couple of new users. But the important thing to remember is that this current player variable is an integer, and you can't compare an integer to a string like this. So we'll have to use that exact same cint statement or cast this as an integer like we had done before. So I'll do cint and wrap this all in that cint statement. So now EPrime is going to take this response of either 1 or 3, turn it into an integer so they can then add it to that current player. And then all I need to do is just do a simple c.setAttrib statement. We have done this one 1,000 times already. We're going to set that, not data file.base name. We're going to set that movie name property. And that is just going to be very similar to last time. We'll have 2, and then an ampersand there, and then current player. And then an ampersand, and then that WMV file. There we go. So now we have the movie that we're actually going to play. And now that we have that movie set, all we need to do is just take this player slide and add it right after get next player, because it's going to be the same. We're going to be playing that exact same player slide, and it's going to be terminating on the same, and it's going to be showing a video the same. So there's really nothing else that we need to do there. And we already have that value of the current player there. So we don't even need to set it anywhere else like we did that send next player, because we've already made that choice in the get next player inline object. The only thing we need to add then is we'll go ahead into this inclusion proc. And I'll bring my browser back up. We'll have that go to end afterwards. And then that'll jump back to the end. Now, there's one more aspect of this we need to add before I can say that the inclusion task is entirely done. And those are these label objects. So right now you notice we have a label for player 1, and we have this really nice inline object here that takes a look at the current player and jumps to that part of them, to that part of the procedure. Now, if you notice here, we don't actually have that for player 2 and player 3. So let's go ahead and make them. So we'll take a label object and put it just before player 2 there. Rename this one to player 2. So what this does, and I'm going to do this for player 3, what this does is it essentially chunks up this procedure and makes sure EPrime only plays certain parts of this procedure at a time. So EPrime is, for example, when the player count or the current player is player 1, it's only going to play from here to here, and then it's going to jump to the end. For player 2, it's only going to go from here to here, and for player 3, only here to here. So while this looks like it's a really long procedure that's doing a lot of stuff, it's actually pretty small, and it's actually only running a very small part of it. So that's how we can set that up and make everything very different here, and for EPrime to kind of handle everything the way that it needs to. All right, so let's go ahead and try to run the task quick. I'm going to just do it in Test Manager here. What I'm going to do actually is none of the clips have any audio, so I'm actually going to uncheck our sound device just so EPrime doesn't gain access to the speakers of the computer. I don't want it to mess up any of the audio in the live stream at all. I'm going to go ahead and click Test, and we'll see how it turned out. So we have our subject number, our session number. Player 1 will make me. Player 2, we're going to go ahead and make Brian. And then my name is Devon, so I'll be throwing to myself in some instances. Continue with the above startup info, and let's see how that turned out. So it'll take just a second to play here. And it also may not, I don't know if you guys can see this on the live stream. It might not actually, so I can see the instruction screens right now, but it doesn't look like it's actually showing up on the display here. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this. All right, so sometimes EPrime doesn't necessarily play nice with streaming services like this. And if you can't see it, that doesn't mean that I can't. I saw that welcome screen and it looked like it had worked pretty well. So yeah, I'm actually just going to, I'll actually just leave this up on the experiment library there, and you guys can go ahead and run this. Because like I said, as soon as this video is done, I'm going to go ahead and upload this experiment right to the experiment library. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I noticed that there was a part that I had forgotten. So in our startup info, I had asked to enter your name, and I didn't actually reference that anywhere. So what I want to do on my player slide is just take a text display object and put it at the very bottom here. Shrink it to make it look a little better. And let's just reference that your name attribute. So now there's going to be player 1, player 3, and then your name will show up at the very bottom. And I want to do that to my throw choice as well. So I'll put that down here. Go ahead and delete that. And this is just going to be your name as well. Perfect. All right, so now that we have our inclusion procedure, we need to make our exclusion procedure. And this is actually going to be a lot easier and a lot faster than you think it is because we already have everything set up. And we're just going to end up referencing the same thing in a couple of places. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my inclusion block proc or exclusion block proc, sorry, and I'm going to set everything up exactly like this. So I want to make an exclusion list here. So we'll go into this exclusion. We'll go ahead and make in a list object there, and I'll call this one exclusion list. And hit enter. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this exclusion list, and I'm going to make something called exclusion proc. There we go. Just so we match our inclusion list at the top. And sure, I'll make that the default value. And I also need this movie name attribute, and I will call this one 1 to 3 as well. Again, this is going to change in the same way that our other ones would. WMV, there we go. And this will just be sequential selection. So in our inclusion list here, it's exactly the same. So then we have our inclusion proc. Now our inclusion proc is going to be set up very similar to our inclusion list. So I'm going to do a pretty fun thing in EPrime that I actually kind of like to do. I'm going to save it here first. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up my inclusion list or inclusion proc there, or exclusion, and open up my inclusion proc there. And instead of having them next to each other, I'm just going to tile them horizontally, and I'm just going to drag and drop things from here to here. Now notice what I'm going to do with this list player 1, list player 2, and list player 3. These are the only parts of my procedure, and literally just the contents of those list objects are the only parts that need to change. The rest of these can maintain complete consistency among all of these. So the way that EPrime adds these list objects whenever I copy and paste them is it's actually going to add them from left to right. And in order to make this so I don't have to do a lot of like flipping around of all this stuff, I'm actually going to load all my list objects first and load them from 3 to 1. That way everything kind of works out nice and neat. And I mean, if you follow along at home, you can definitely just copy them like 1 to 1, but you'll have to be doing some moving around, and I like this structure. So I'll show you how that works. So I'm going to take my list player 3, hit Control C, jump to my exclusion proc, and hit Control V. It says the object you're pasting contains child objects. Would you like to paste all of them? I'm going to say no, because these objects underneath them here, the prepare player 3, player slide, those kinds of things, I want those to be exactly the same. The only thing I want to be different is the value of this, or the values in that list object, because I'm going to make it more exclusionary. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this list player 4. I'm going to rename this one to, I'm going to call it exclusion list, so X list, or X player 3. That way whenever this loads into EPrime, I know that this is my exclusion condition and it's for player 3. I'm going to double click on it to open it here, and all I want to do is change these ratios. It's set to 10 to 1, go to player 2. I'm going to set this one to, let's say, 30 to 1. So there's way more of a chance that target player 1's going to get this. And what I'm actually going to do is go into my properties page, and I'm going to change this reset sampling to after 31 samples. So it has to go through 30 samples, or randomly between all of the 30 samples, before it can get to my one possible throw to player 2. So that just makes it a little more exclusionary there. I want to do the same thing to list player 2. Hit Control C here, hit Control V. I do not want to paste the child objects. And this is what I was talking about, where it kind of adds from left to right here, or adds on the far left. So instead of adding it to the right here, it added it to the far left, which is why I'm starting with 3. And I'm just going to rename this one to X player 2. Oops. And I'm going to make that exact same change. No, that one can actually stay the same. And I'm going to go ahead and save it quick. And then do my same thing to my list player 1. I do not want to paste those. Call this one, oops, go ahead and rename this one to X player 1. There we go. And then we want to make that same change here. So I want possibility of 1 throw to player 2 and 30 throws to player 3. I'm going to change my selection here to all samples there. And I'm only going to run 1 at a time. There we go. So now that we added the list objects, all we need to do is add the little tiny components that we were missing before. So that is actually just a very simple drag and drop. So I'm going to take my go to player 1 object and just drag it down here. Take my player 1, drag it down there. My go to end statement, my player 2, my go to end, my player 3, my go to end, and the end. And there we go. That was really all you had to do to make that entire exclusion procedure. And now, you see our experiment looks like it's really big, but when EPrime loads it, it's actually going to be really small. And the reason it's going to be small is because we have these player slides here, and all of these objects that we're loading here are exactly the same across all of the procedures. So EPrime only needs to load these one time, and then it just references that loaded object over and over and over. So while our Experiment Explorer might look like this is a gigantic experiment, it's actually pretty small and pretty manageable. All right, so that's actually all we need to do to make Cyberball in EPrime. If anyone has any questions at all, I saw that there were a couple of questions, especially in relation to playing the video. My answer to that is it sounds like you have your own videos. Definitely wait for mine. I made sure my videos play in EPrime. And EPrime 3 should play them without any problem, especially if you are using EPrime 3. And if that code I config didn't work for you, like I said, I should be uploading those very shortly. So go ahead and wait for my videos, and I'll upload those and go ahead and check out my version of the task. If you have any questions after making this task, if you're like, oh, why did you do that thing? Because, this is a live stream. I want to do a lot of stuff just for demonstration purposes, like that select case statement. If you have any questions about how I built it, why I built it this way, anything like that, feel free to either comment on the video or go ahead and just leave a support ticket. Go to support.pstnet.com. We're always happy to help on there. Otherwise, thank you guys very much for attending. Next week we have a really cool video. It's going to be next week, it's actually on Thursday, so in 2 days, we have a really cool video. It's a working memory task, and the thing I like the most about this is it's actually it was actually recommended to me by a user. So I was talking with a user and they said, hey, I'd love to see this as one of the live streams. So if you guys have any recommendations for live streams, or if you have tasks that you're working on or something you'd like to see me build, or hey, I have this, but is this the best way to do this in EPrime, and have any recommendations, definitely let me know. Either leave a comment on this video or send us a support ticket. I'd be more than happy to make videos based on what I know our user base wants. So by all means, please let us know. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. YouTube kind of changed the way the algorithm works a little bit for like subscriptions and stuff. So subscribing to the channel definitely does help us and definitely lets me keep doing these kinds of things. So again, thank you guys so much for coming today. I hope you guys had a good time, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.